Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode. I am Michelle Lierre, and this is the Jewelers Academy podcast. I am here with one of my favorite people. Her name is Nicole Ringgold. She is a metalsmith, a silversmith. We use different terms here in the United States, so a lot of times we say metalsmith. But she works with fine materials like silver and gold, and she is located in the north corner of Washington State, actually not that far from me if you have an airplane and you want to jump over the mountain range. But she lives in the middle of the Cascade Mountains in a gorgeous place. She's been working with metal and silver for about 13 years. And I'm very excited to have her here to talk about her new book coming out and some of her things that we call the Nicole way. And these are my favorite things about you. So go ahead, Nicole, say hi to everybody. They
Hello.
haven't met you before. So go
Hi.
ahead and let us know a little bit more about you.
Well, hi, I'm Nicole, as you know, and Ringold is my last name. I was born with it. A lot of people ask me if I renamed myself, which I didn't. Very much coincidental. I stumbled upon silversmithing totally by accident. When we were constructing our house in 2009, I was working with river rocks, drilling through them to make all of the cabinet knobs around our home, and became 100% addicted to working with river rocks. And so decided to start wire wrapping. And after 2 years of that, by 2011, bought my first torch and fell in love and haven't looked back since.
That's amazing. When you bought your first torch, what was it?
A little smith. And
It was.
I was looking into the torches that would probably be least problematic, because in my home and with my child, and that could be insured. I had a 4-year-old daughter, 4, 5, 6-year-old daughter, and her room was right next to my 2B studio. And when I read about oxygen propane, it seemed like the best way to go. So I went with that. And it was lucky that here in Washington State, that could be insured inside my home. So I went straight with that and taught myself from scratch how to make chains. I gave myself a self-challenge of 100 chains. And from there was super hooked on silversmithing.
So you went from, had you had any kind of torch experience before?
So I went to a tiny college in Ohio where I did take a couple of classes in metalsmithing, but what we did was more lost cast wax and not torch enamel. We did kiln enameling, but I don't remember there being a torch, but there could have been, but it was not a little smith. I know that I did one sawing project, but it was super basic. And when I picked up a torch, the little smith torch, I really had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know what.
Most people start with like the little handheld ones, that you fill up with butane or whatever, with lighter fluid or something, like the little culinary ones. And so I just think it's very indicative of your personality, and also kind of like surprising that somebody would go from no experience with using a torch at all to using propane, oxygen, like hoses, the whole 9 yards, the whole works. So then what happened? You're doing river rocks, you're doing wire wrapping, you've got your first torch.
Mm-hmm.
What was
next? So like I said, I started by giving myself self-challenges. I started with 100 chains, and it was during that process that I was, the little round links where you're trying to create link on link and link. And I, at first, was trying to figure out how to do that with solder, and used way too much solder, and all my links were soldering together. So I thought, well, what happens if I don't use solder? So I started to fuse sterling silver, and I think that's where my world started to separate from most metalsmiths. And then,
so you said sterling silver, not fine silver, not argentium silver, sterling.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
We'll talk about that some more.
Yeah, right. So then in 2014, I just kept like limping my way through. I was still working full time, directing nonprofits. I was a mother. I was a small scale farmer, et cetera, et cetera. And just doing the silversmithing on the side. And in 2014, I set a goal for myself, and that was to work in the nonprofit realm for the next year, so that for the next 3 years, to save a year's worth of income, so that by 2017 I could quit my job and I would have a year's worth of income to fall back on as a silversmith. And so that was my goal. But then in 2014, we lost our home and my studio to a wildfire. And it was then that my husband encouraged me to become a full-time silversmith. So I quit my job. We got a new tiny house. I got a grant from Surf Plus, and then Rio Grande gave me a $500 gift certificate and put me on a pro account. And I took the leap and became a full-time artist later in 2014. And then promptly went into debt for the next year to myself. I had to borrow money from our savings to pay for my rent, and was really struggling to find my way as an artist. And then it was in 2015 that I set another self-challenge for myself, and that was the 30 Botanicals, where I literally took 30 different botanicals, dissected them, and recreated them in silver, learning how to form with hammers and stakes and saw more efficiently. And then it was then that I taught myself how to use heat sinks to prevent previous solder joints from flowing, et cetera, where it became much more sculptural. So after those 30 botanicals, my world kind of burst wide open.
So I've also been through a wildfire. Thankfully, we didn't lose our home, but half our community did. So that's something that's pretty close to my heart, and also I still freak out a little bit when the sky turns a certain color. You lost everything, your studio, your tools, everything. And then after that, you had this, in the middle of that, before that, you had this plan that was very logical. It's like very safe, very logical, not easy. And that was gone. And so you just decided, okay, I'm just gonna just do it. I'm just gonna go for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's pretty scary. And then not just go for it, but I'm gonna do this botanical challenge where I take something and remake it, and you're completely ignoring whether it's sellable or whether people are going to want it or whether you're going to be able to make money. How did that happen? How were you able to make those choices, and what was that like? Because I'm sure there's people right now that are maybe in that same boat or have some hard decisions to make.
Yeah, it was hard. And it was probably the most stressful time for me financially, because honestly, to that point, I was more of the moneymaker in our family. But you have to keep in mind what happened was that we lost everything, but we purchased really, really small. So we basically wiped our slate clean and decided that instead of repurchasing everything that we'd had, we were going to make some very deliberate choices. We weren't going to buy all of the skis that we had previously or the bikes, and we weren't going to buy all of our backpacking equipment again. We were going to be very deliberate in our decision-making about how to move forward. So that was one thing that saved us, because it wasn't that we just suddenly went and purchased all these things and spent our money. So we had a little bit for me to fall back on. So there was that savings there. But honestly, I think more importantly was that I have wanted to be an artist my entire life. So my undergraduate degree was studio art and sociology. I did sociology because I was told that as an artist, you could never make money. So I went the sociology route, and didn't make a whole lot of money, but at least, I was making a stable income. But all of that time was always on the side wanting to do art and kind of complaining about it, wanting to figure out how to make that leap. And this was our one opportunity. And I, in my soul, knew that I could do it. There was just, my gut knew that I could do it. And to do it, I think you just have to have that belief. You have to have that faith, because if you keep telling yourself you can't or it's not possible, then so I didn't even go there. Yeah, it was stressful financially, but I didn't even go there. And I knew that I had about a year, maybe a little bit more, until I needed to consider another source of income. But I gave myself that grace of at least a year or a year and a half. And so it was within that I just thought, okay, I don't have to sell anything right now. I was selling some, but I wasn't selling like I am now, or like I did a year after my botanicals. But I don't know. I just had to go. I just had to. I had to.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes
I
sense.
like my eyes are getting a little watery. Like I was like it hit me really hard because I mean, I know what it's like. And I know there's people everywhere that have a passion. And I think throughout talking to you, and I guess what I want people to hear from you is like, you have it, do it. Your story is so inspiring because you took a passion and it's become you're teaching and you're selling jewelry and you're making miniature buildings and you're like it's your case behind you and I know there's little miniature buildings in that case and now you have a book that's coming out and it's amazing. And before we get to that, we'll get to that eventually. I want you to tell me about your challenge, the 30 days that you did, and like what you discovered and what you learned about your processes. Because one of the things that's super special about you is number one, you're not afraid to take risks. And number two, you're very, I could say stubborn in a very like admiring kind of way. Like you're determined. And people, I'm sure, were telling you, oh no, you can't do that. And they probably still do. But tell me about some of the stuff that you learned during that challenge, what you discovered.
Yeah. I guess one thing I do want to say before I jump into that too is that, like I said, I had a young child, a girl, and as a mother, as a woman in this world, and especially a woman who has working hands, it was exceedingly important for me to succeed, or at least to show her that I was going to put my all into this thing, especially after we lost everything. It was so important for me to be the best role model I could ever be to her. And so that was part of my stubbornness, my determination as well. So there was that. So yeah, the 30-day challenge, that was huge. That was I sometimes brush over that when I'm telling people about myself, but really when I look back at it, it was a big deal for me. Because so what happened was that after the fire, and back in that time, social media was kind of just taking off. In 2009, I joined Facebook. So 2014, 15, I had been told about Instagram and that it was a platform I should check out, but I hadn't yet. But I did recognize that what was happening all around me was that there were so many artists using social media. And at that point, I had my work in like 25 galleries. And I was having a really hard time keeping up with the demand. And I was looking at other people's work on Pinterest and on Etsy. At that point, I think I was using Etsy and didn't have my own website. And so I made some changes. I went off of Etsy. I started my own website. But in looking at Pinterest, I was comparing myself to everyone out there, and it was daunting. It was so incredibly,
Yeah.
I felt like I was drowning in a world of talent, and I couldn't figure out how to set myself apart from the masses. And so what I did was I literally stopped looking at the computer almost for that 3 months of when I was doing the 30 botanicals. I set my
30 botanicals, not 30 days, 30 botanicals.
30 botanicals, and it took me about 3 months. And it started because I saw a lot of people were casting their work, which not at all a negative thing. It's just I was, again, looking for something different. And I saw that people were doing electroforming. but I hadn't seen a lot of fabrication. I saw fabrication of some flowers, roses, some leaves, of course, but nothing really three-dimensional plants. And so it was during a trail run at some point that I just decided that's what I needed to do, that to try to push myself to another level and to maybe set myself apart from the masses. So that's what happened. And I throughout the 3 months, it's just funny that I chose it when it was going into the winter, because botanicals are hard to come by in the winter. But I was working in a greenhouse, so I went through the greenhouse every time I came in and started a new botanical. I would choose a leaf or a flower or a branch or a string of pearls, succulent. And then, of course, when I made my way through the greenhouse, I went to the grocery store and I chose broccoli. I chose a pea pod, and what I really learned was, well, I made a lot of mistakes. I used only easy solder the entire way through those 30 botanicals. I had no idea that medium and hard solder existed. So that's one thing that was just, I had no idea.
I love that. I love that.
So I taught myself how to use heat sinks to prevent solder flow from previous solder flow from flowing again, or previous solder joints from flowing. And I came up with some really wild outside the box ways of forming, using nails and pencils and knitting needles. And and at that time, Rio Grande and other wholesale suppliers didn't have a lot on their websites. That was, for me, it didn't make a lot of sense. So you had to like flip through all the catalogs to figure out how to use certain tools and drill bits. And so I ordered drill bits and was trying them out, trying to make ginkgo leaves, figuring out how to make the textures, and just, it was all trial and error. And I screwed up right and left. But I always felt that that was the best way to learn, rather than have someone tell me that I couldn't do it.
Yeah. Yes. I have watched you work before, and I just remember one of the things I remember watching you do was carving your shape after you had created the basic shape that you wanted, and you're carving it. And I think are they wax bits that you use? They're like extremely aggressive bits for your pendant motor, and you're just fearless. Like, if I was to try that, my fingers would be ripped up. And you make it look so easy, and you're fearless in the things that you're doing. You're just like, and you just do them. When you were doing that process, did you get negative feedback from people, or did you have people saying, oh no, I'm sorry, you couldn't do that, when you're trying to figure something out? Or did that happen like afterwards?
I would say that's a two-part answer. One is that when I started teaching in 2017, I had students coming to my studio saying, holy cow, I never knew that you could fuse sterling silver. So part of it is having heard from other people who've taken workshops all over the world telling me, oh, we had no idea. And I've grown a lot teaching and continuing to experiment. So that's one part of my answer. And the other part is, I've had, after I do a thing and then I put it out on social media, having lifelong metalsmiths tell me there's a much more efficient way to go about what you're doing. And what a waste of metal, even though they don't realize I use that metal that I'm carving off. 100% of my metal is used. But I can understand them saying, oh my gosh, look at all that metal that's being wasted. I can understand why they might say that.
You give people such freedom to explore. And you talk about the Nicole way. Can you explain to me a little bit when we talk about the Nicole way? I wish we could call your book that, but I don't think people would understand it.
That I think that's continuing to evolve. The Nicole way is, because same where I didn't know what kind of solder was out there. It's the same. I didn't know what lingo to use. So a lot of it's Nicole terminology, because I might, as I'm trying to explain my methods as I'm teaching, I'll use language that's not necessarily correct. So there's that. That's one of the Nicole ways. And another Nicole way as well, the fusing, for instance, it's a Nicole way of working through something, because most people who are metalsmiths don't realize that you can fuse sterling silver. So there are techniques that I think that's what you're referring to are the Nicole way, because it's just what I do. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes. So I want to hear from you again. So you've done 3 months, you've done a botanical challenge. What came next?
Yeah, I remember at the end of the 3 months and saying, okay, this is my last botanical of the 30 botanicals. What's next? And I remember I was blogging back then, and I had photo documented my 30 botanicals and put it out there put each one of them out there on my blog. And my last blog was, now what? And I remember the answer was, I'm just going to keep going with these because I'm learning so much. And I kind of highlighted all of the things that I had learned. A lot of it was about heat sinks. A lot of it was about how to, like you said, the process of putting things together. I remember doing my first flower botanical and trying to get all of the components to layer. And I sawed out each individual petal for each flower and tried to solder it to the mass individually, one by one. And I remember doing an acorn cap and sawed out each of the tiny triangles individually. And then I dapped the cap and then tried to solder each of them onto the cap in a spiral formation. And it was through that I realized, wow, there are so many better ways to go about this so it was the discovering of more efficient processes for me without having a manual to refer to. So there was that. And I continued and I still look back at some of those first 30 or some of the first 500, and I'm learning and I'm changing my processes and I'm understanding better ways of going about it. Like I just recently came up with, you may have seen it, a way to fuse spirals to create hollow form pieces.
Yes.
So rather than a carrot, for instance, I put that on my Instagram, and fusing scraps and rolling it, I call that log rolling it and fusing it, I now am able to create a spiral and fuse it so it's a lot lighter weight and it doesn't use as much material. So just discovering as I just keep trying things out.
I love that. I'm trying to envision how you would, because I learned your like coil method for barnacles, which is that in your book, the barnacles?
The barnacles, not coiling, but yes, the shell and barnacles are in the book. Yes.
Okay. If you want to learn the coiling, you have to go to Winthrop and then go to Twist and then and then take a class live.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're talking about evolving and changing and learning new methods. And you're talking a lot about like heat sinks was a big one for you, and being able to take small pieces and solder them or fuse them to a larger piece. I think a lot of people struggle with that. And is there anything that pops to your mind as far as like some things that helped you with figuring out your flame, your heat, and your order of how you did things?
There are two things. Again, two-part answer. One is I focus a lot on color, on the color of the silver. If we're talking silver specifically, I focus a lot on the color of the silver and how it changes as I'm working with it. So once I or my students really dial in on what those colors are, they'll be able to really understand what they're working with. So for instance, gray means that the silver is dirty, brittle. Even if it comes straight from the wholesale supplier and you take it out and you've purchased dead soft silver, it still needs to be annealed. And then I pickle it because as soon as I anneal and then pickle it, it's white.
It's
White means that it's been annealed and pickled, which means it's clean and it's malleable. Then after you've applied your flux and you're working with your torch and your solder is about to flow, there's this slight yellow hue. The yellow hue means solder flow point. Then if you're continuing to heat it and your silver turns black, that means there's no more flux. It means your silver has oxidized. Red, melting point. And if you're fusing, that's when the magic happens. So if you get that equation or those colors, then you can really start to become almost like a silver whisperer. So that's one part of my answer. I really understand, like if your solder is not flowing and you're working with this mass and you've got this tiny little thing that you're trying to add like right over here, and you've got the mass over here and you're trying to solder over here, and this whole thing is white, but over here is black, it means you're focusing your torch right there and you're not heating the mass.
right.
So that's how, like, if you then stop and you look at your silver and you look at the colors, you should be able to diagnose what you're doing wrong. So then that brings in the part 2 of the answer, and that's where I focus a lot on mass, especially as you're working sculpturally. So for instance, if I'm putting all of these layers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers onto a piece of wire, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 layers, but my 5th layer is being stubborn, and I'm just trying to get one tiny joint at the top layer to solder, and all of these are soldered. If I'm heating and everything down here is white or yellow and the top piece is black, it means that I'm only heating that top piece and I'm not heating the mass. So I focus a lot on mass, because the entire mass needs to be heated in order for this tiny little solder joint to flow.
And sometimes that means that your structure has to be different, because if you can't get your heat to your mass where you have your thickest or most amount of material without melting something, then your construction needs to change somehow.
Yeah, true.
So that being able to focus on, and you call it the heat mass, don't you? When you're talking about it, when you're teaching, you call it, where is your heat mass? Like,
I talk about it as a mass, and then I talk about heat sinks. So if I have a mass that's all of these layers and there's one upper layer and I'm trying to protect these, I might put a heat sink there, but I still have to heat my mass. But
right.
the heat sink will protect all of the other solder joints, but you still have to heat them in order for this little bit to flow.
So you're trying to protect something, but not so much that you can't heat it.
Exactly.
So finding that balance. And I would think that that's just experience. Like, you just have to try it and you have to do it and you have to fail. And then you have to figure out, like, there's no magic formula other than give it a try and figure out how to change it.
Right.
The first time I talked to you over video for the first time, I had dived into making a filigree flower, and I was trying to I had these filigree leaves at the bottom, and I was trying to solder the whole thing together, and I actually went and got a different torch because I didn't have enough. That was when I upgraded from a little handheld to a bigger torch, because I didn't have enough firepower to actually heat the whole thing to the same temperature or to the high enough temperature. And so I remember talking to you and being like, I don't know how to finish this. I have all these components I've made and I don't know how to put them together without completely destroying all this really beautiful open work filigree that I had created. And you were kind enough just to like get on video with me and take a look at what I was doing and help me figure out the process, whether it's me going back and remaking it because I had probably put too much open work that was going to overheat or it was going to collapse, and too much mass on one side. And I was able to finish it, and it ended up going in an art gallery to commemorate a fire in my area. So it's kind of personal, but it was like that moment of like you just being willing to have a conversation. I was super new and I never really used a big torch before. I was working in a dirt floor cellar. which was great because when I dropped things, I didn't have to worry, but they did disappear. Somebody, if they go down there with a metal detector, I'm sure they'll find some treasures.
But it looked beautiful in the end.
Yeah, and just having that experience, I know you're like this, and I'm like this, and then there's quite a few other people that are that we don't start with the most simple. We just like
Right.
jump into the deep end and sink or swim, and it's either going to be an epic success or an epic failure, and maybe a little bit of both. But there's like a constant living on the edge, like
Mhm.
thrill seeking by making these beautiful pieces, and then like being on the brink of like them completely falling apart because
Right.
we're like, I don't know what I'm doing.
Right. But there's so
Figuring
much
it out.
learning. There's the value in the learning.
Yeah. Yes. And taking those risks and just going in. Okay. So your book. I got to read just like your opening intro. And do we have like a I know it's on pre-order, but when is it projected to be available?
April 2024.
Okay.
April 2nd.
But people can pre-order it right now.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes. And the title of it is
The
The
new
New Metalsmith,
the new silversmith.
New Silversmith.
Yep.
And their intro talks about you noticing your environment and noticing the textures and going outside and collecting things and just being enamored with these textures. I would love to hear a little bit more about some of the things that you love the most, textures you love the most, and then
Oh, wow.
processes. I know. It's okay. Whatever off the
There's
top of your head, whatever you
so
think of.
many. I just remember, and I think it was shortly after I maybe completed the first 30. And I remember going out on a hike and picking up a stick and thinking, looking at the bark. And this was before I delved into the fabrication of bark, but looking at the bark and thinking, wow. And then another time going out to the beach over on the Washington coast and picking up a shell with the barnacles and thinking, how? And I went back and I did fabricate that shell. And wow, my world was split wide open just because of those things on that shell. Looking at some of the barnacles were crusted and looked like they were full. I mean, it was definitely not, they weren't alive, but then some of them were popped open and broken off. And yeah. And just looking at like going to Australia and picking up off the ground a gum nut or a eucalyptus pod and seeing the decaying eucalyptus pod and the textures on the outside versus the inside. And yeah, all of that. It's fascinating to me.
I love that.
Through a forest in Maine, Vermont and Maine, and look at the birch bark all along the forest floor, covered with this incredibly soft looking lichen. And how do you capture in metal the contrast between the bark that's peeling and looks sharp, but then the soft moss right on top of it, kind of circling its way through the crevices of that bark? It's just incredible. How can you do that?
How?
Yeah.
So you like think about it for how long do you think about things before you actually attempt to like how long does it like swim around and roll around in your head of like how would I do that?
You know, it's if I travel to the East Coast to visit family, for instance, and we go hiking and I pick up bark, I will take home a suitcase of bark, and by the time I get to my studio, I'm diving in. But if it's here on a hike and I go out mushroom hunting, I come back with mushrooms and it's that day or the next day. I have to try it immediately.
Because it's just in there and you like sparked the creativity and the ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the first things I did, I love to do this for anyone, is on their Instagram, I'll scroll back as far as I can because I want to see how people started. I want to see what their first pieces look like. I want to see the progression, if they even show it. Some people don't.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating to watch the evolution of people's creativity.
Agreed.
When I think of you, I think of like you're literally sculpting. You're using this material. It's not stone. It's not It's not ceramic. It's not something that you can push with your fingers to sculpt, or, like, it's not wax. You're literally taking silver and you're actually sculpting with your torch, which is amazing. I don't even know if it's possible to describe that process of sculpting with your torch, but can you attempt to describe it over audio?
I think you're talking mostly about the manipulation of how I move the metal with my torch.
Yes. I have never in my life ever seen anyone else do that.
Yeah. So you can sculpt with your torch to a point, and then the rest of it is done with the flex shaft or with the hammer and stakes. But the sculpting with the torch that you're talking about is, gosh, it's like, I think of it as like almost like painting, so I talked about the colors of the silver. And then once you reach red, if you're fusing, if you're not soldering, if you're just fusing and you reach red, that's when the magic happens. It's the red, and when the silver starts to reticulate, it's like it hovers. It reminds me of Terminator 2. That
I love that you just threw that reference in.
that I don't even remember what he was called, but he was like this guy, a metal guy, who would like slither into a puddle and then come back up into a person or a form. Metal does that. It follows the heat of your torch, or silver does. So like if you've got this puddle and then you heat the center of the puddle, it'll come to the center and turn into this ball, right? And but if you have a sheet and you take your torch and wait until it's red and it's starting to quiver under the heat, and you move your torch, it's going to want to like move with your torch.
The silver itself actually follows the heat of your torch.
Correct.
So if you want it to like mound up more on one side than the other, then you heat it, and then you almost pull the silver.
Right. You draw it. You coax it.
You draw it.
Yeah. You're like coaxing it. You're teasing it. It's totally a play with the silver.
But you can't do that if you're too cautious. If you're too, when you're working with silver, if you're too like, I don't want to heat it too much.
Usually when people have that mind frame, you can do it, but what they don't realize is that it's okay to do it. They think that it's dropping an F-bomb, which I'm not supposed to do on this podcast. So
there might be children listening.
They think that it's a frightening thing because you're melting the silver. What I love about teaching this process is that you can actually repair holes with the process. You can lay down wire over, if you've burnt a hole in your silver, you can fix it by fusing more silver in there and spreading it out with your torch. And it'll look organic, and it might have some, air bubbles that pop in it, but that's part of the beauty of working with the silver. If you're looking for like mirror finish perfection, that this isn't the technique to use. But what is amazing about it is if you work with scraps, then at least you can really learn the limits of working with that metal with that technique. You can learn about how far you can take the metal.
So is there a point of no return with silver? Like, can you work with it to a point, or overheat it, or heat it to a point where it can no longer be used? Because I've seen people say that it's now reticulated and it's like kind of crunchy. And is there any point where you are now like, I can't use this piece, it needs to go to the, recycle refinery?
No.
Unless
you're saying I want this to be a perfect piece of metal, you can still melt it down, put it through your crucible in your rolling mill and turn it out into sheet. You can still do that. But if you're saying this is not it's not perfect metal for me to work with, and I don't have a crucible and I don't have a rolling mill, and this is the only type of art form I want, then yeah, I guess you need to send it off to your refinery. But if you're looking to then, if you want to take your scraps and turn it into a branch or turn it into a beetle, no, you can
There's
continue to,
no point.
there's no point.
You could just,
At
you
least
could
not that I
continue
have
to use it.
discovered. I could be wrong. I'm not always right, but I have not discovered an endpoint.
Where the silver has been like irreparably altered.
Right. The one time that is hard, especially if you're doing the fusing technique, is when you combine the metals. So if you have bezel wire in your sterling silver scraps and you melt down the sterling silver and you've got this bezel wire in there that floats to the surface, you can still work with it, but you can't necessarily do the techniques I'm talking about. So
bezel wire would be like fine silver.
right.
Okay. So working with fine silver, a lot of people say, well, you have to fuse with fine silver if you're going to work with it. What is it about fine silver that doesn't work for you?
It puddles. It doesn't build the way sterling silver does.
It puddles. So it doesn't like with the torch.
Right.
It doesn't.
It has a tendency to do this versus this. When
So
you're
going flat instead of coning up. Okay.
right. And then when you combine the sterling silver and the fine silver in one, when I'm trying to fuse onto the sterling silver, if there's fine silver at the surface, the fine silver will puddle at the top. It'll come to the surface, right? So like when you anneal, the fine silver comes to the surface.
Right.
It's depletion gilding, right? So that the fine silver comes to the surface. It's the same thing. If you have a glob of fine silver in with your sterling silver, it will come to the surface and it will make the sculpting a lot more challenging.
So if your fine silver content is too high, some people make their own alloys. If you have too much fine silver, sterling here is considered 935 parts silver out of 1,000. And the rest is copper. And I think there's one other thing. Is it just copper and sterling silver? I feel like there was one other thing, but I can't remember it. I guess it would depend.
It depends, but
if your fine silver content is higher than that 925, sorry, I said 935 is actually 925. Yes. 935 is what I use, which would be too much.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Different techniques, completely different method. Yeah. So if somebody's alloy is too high in fine silver, they're going to have trouble with some of the sculpting and mounding and getting those three-dimensional shapes that you're talking about.
Correct.
So have you found any sterling that the alloy doesn't work, or is it pretty much as long as there's not too much fine silver in it, it'll be fine?
That, the second, yes.
Okay. Okay. I'm just thinking about people that are like, what if I'm making my own? Like how much,
right?
What do I put in it? Okay.
But I mean, so it's just worth experimenting. I'm still not going to do it.
Yeah. If it puddles, take away some of the fine silver and add something else.
Right. Yeah. And I've often found that when it puddles and the fine silver comes to the surface, I can literally, when I'm heating, take my pick and just scrape it off the top.
That's amazing. That is very cool. I don't think I've ever done that.
Just play, right?
Yeah. Just play. And that could almost be like your subtitle for your book, because that's what it feels like. That's what it feels like when you're working with some of the techniques you're talking about, taking away the fear of messing up, of screwing up, and just allowing yourself to play.
I feel like all of our jobs should be that way.
Yeah. I mean, we just get super stressed and thinking about, like, how am I going to deal with this debt? Or I bought all these tools. Right. Now what?
Yeah.
And we don't have the space internally to really be able to push that back and just allow ourselves that freedom of creativity to just go for it.
Agreed.
Yeah. So in your book, you start out with some techniques that we've been talking about. Some of the technical stuff. I think I saw that you talk about the metal, you talk about the colors, and then what?
The book it kind of outlines my journey. It talks about my discovery of silversmithing, my coming from a generation telling me that you can't make a living as an artist. So I come out of that. I didn't really take this leap until I was in my 40s. So there's something to be said there that for 40 plus years of my life, I was afraid to take that leap, and I finally took it. So that's where the book is born. And then finally taking that leap into this world of discovering metal. So there's that, and explaining that discovery, walking readers through the don't be afraid of waste, because you can turn them into branches. And if you're able to make branches, then you can make a dragonfly body. And if you can make a dragonfly body, then you can make a butterfly body that's kinetic with kinetic wings. And so it's like taking people through my transformation and giving them all of the tutorials along the way, as many as I could with the word limit I was given. So so it was, and my daughter took all of the photography. And so, of course, with her at college, we could only fit in so many times for her to come back to my studio to take pictures. But so it's a walk through that. And it's also, there are a lot of lessons on sustainability, how you can do it with as few chemicals as possible. Also being cognizant of the impact that we have on the earth. So lots of messages out about that.
Yeah, I love that. I'm looking forward to being able to look through everything. I am surprised. I'm like looking at your table of contents, and you have projects in your book. So you talk about your techniques, and then you have all of these cool projects. And I'm just reading it, and it's like chain designs and branches and dragonflies and butterflies, bark. What project, I would like to know, even the clamshell with barnacles is in here. Which project would you say is your most favorite? Like if you could pick one of these projects from your book to teach, which one would you pick to teach?
Of the ones that are just in the book.
Yeah.
I love teaching the bark and the lichen. So probably that.
For those of you listening by audio, I just encourage you to look up Nicole, and we'll give all of her details at the end. Will you talk to me about, and we're getting close to wrapping up, but some of your favorite tools, some of the things you reach for the most in your workshop? I always like to have something to recommend to people, like, hey, if you want to get into forming and doing this kind of sculpting, what are some of your top things that have really been helpful and beneficial for you?
Okay, aside from my torch.
Aside from your torch.
Yes, and I use a Littlesmith oxypropane. Swear by it. I'm
gonna do a whole thing on just torches.
Okay. Yeah, and that's really good. I love when students come here and they tell me I'm scared to set up my torch at home. I love FaceTiming with students to get them set up with their torches at home so that they feel comfortable. That's one of my favorite things to do, because that first, if you can get over that and feel comfortable working with your torch in your home,
you got it. You got what you need.
I love that. So I'm glad that you're doing a podcast only on that. It's so important. Outside of my torch, I would say that I have 4 different tools that are probably my favorite. And I am going to do a pitch for Lion Punch Forge.
Okay, for Chris. Actually, he was my last podcast person.
Oh, good. Because 2 of his are my favorite. So I'm going to start with his. We call them the titty tweezers, the tie tweezers. Right?
Because they're made of titanium
tweezers. So these are some of my favorite, and I use these for a lot of things. But one of the things I love about them is that when I'm fusing, I can fusing wire onto sheet. They offer a perfect grip. They don't get hot. They're comfortable in my hand. I love them. Love these tie tweezers. So there's that. The second one he sent me recently, so 2 of them are his, is this tie quad. In this,
yes, I have one.
And It's collapsible.
So she's got these two pieces that intersect, and then a little a round piece that goes on the top, and it's like this teeny little miniature stand for soldering.
It's awesome for that I've found it's incredible for my hollow forms and enameling. I do torch enameling, and I love it for torch enameling. So bravo, Chris, because you've sold me on these two. And I'm pretty sure every time I have workshops now, you're getting some good orders. So those two.
And that is made also out of titanium.
Yes.
Yes.
At least the ones that I have. And then, of course, these Victoria Manfred, they're the Eastern repose and chasing tools. And there are 4 of them in particular that I use. It comes as a set. They're made by frets, but there are 4 in particular that I use. Can you see these 4?
Okay, so we've got like a really small,
Got a straight edge.
They're about pencil width, the forming tools themselves. And then 2 of them look kind of like mushrooms.
Oh yeah, whoops. I included one of them. I got the wrong one. Should I?
That's okay. So only one of them looks like a mushroom.
So this one mushroom, that's a deep, oh, where am I? Deep throat? Is that what you'd call it? Or what would you call that?
I have no idea.
Okay, well, it's got a little bit deeper. And then this one is where are you? You're over here. This one, smaller one. And this one fits nicely underneath the wire. So I do a lot of forming with those 3.
So they're really small forming tools, kind of, we probably would call them punches in other places. And they have different shapes at the tip. So the ones that she's talking about are kind of mushroom shaped, so that you can put the mushroom shape kind of underneath a 3-dimensional shape. Like if you have like the parts of the leaf that you have that are raised up, and you want to get into that corner, and you want to start forming it down and rounding it out, you can put that really small mushroom shape right into those spots. And you're using, like, what are you using with these forming? You're using a hammer.
Using a hammer and the stake straight on the silver. Some people use them in pitch. Some people use them on sand blocks or rubber blocks, and I love using it just directly on my anvil.
Right, on your anvil.
I use it to both texture and to form my sheet.
And one of the things I learned from you when you are forming is when your metal starts looking shiny, it's time to anneal.
Correct. Yay.
Yes. I remembered. I also learned that my hands cannot do repose. I made a leaf. I'll never do this again because my hands literally cannot hold a hammer that long because I have carpal tunnel. So always good to learn that about yourself, that I filigree is the right technique for me.
And your work is beautiful.
Thank you. Okay, so forming tools from Victoria Langford, and I can go on and look and see what's available over at in the UK. But forming tools, and then 2 soldering assistant pieces from Chris at Lion Punch Forge.
Yes.
And what's your 4th?
The last one.
Oh, that one looks heavy.
Of course.
She's holding up a big set that has a whole bunch of punches, metal punches that are round, forming tools, dapping block.
Durston specifically. Because what I of course use this for so many different kinds of hollow forms and flowers and acorns and seed pods. But what I love about Durston is that, and I think you can moderate it yourself. Not moderate, what's the word? You can modify, thank you. Modify it yourself. But what's perfect about it is that when you're forming inside the cups, inside the dapping block, your pieces don't get stuck with this one because it's tapered here on the edge. And especially when you're trying to elongate a pod, I think I have an example.
And you need to hammer it sideways. So she's got a dapping block, which is like a cube, and it has like round hemispheres in it that you use to form with the round punches that look like they have a ball on the end. You're using that to shape and to form things into like hemispheres or round pieces.
Right. And when you're trying to elongate the form like this, you're going to smaller,
like a pointed acorn shape.
it's easy with other dapping blocks for them to get stuck inside the cup, and it's almost impossible to get them out. But with the Durston, that rarely happens to me. So that's probably one of my favorite tools as well.
I have a really cheap set that I still use. And I would think that you could, we talked about metal forming in with Chris about how to alter steel, but you could polish out the edges if you have just a cheap set that doesn't have those edges kind of smoothed over. You probably could alter those if you needed to.
Yeah, I think so.
Also nice to just have a really good tool.
Yes, it is. Yes.
And that, like, what she was talking about was you're not just making round hemispheres, you're taking a piece and you're actually like doming it so that it becomes more of a cylinder or an elongated piece. And when you do that, you have to like hammer sideways almost in your cup. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing those tools with us. Most of those are, I know Chris's are available to order internationally. And I know that dapping blocks and forming punches are very available. So those, you could find them just about anywhere, or you could probably make them yourself out of, you know.
With these, I get mine through Rio, but I think that you can go straight to Victoria's website and order them.
Victoria Langford is the one that,
right.
Yes.
And I think
they're called Eastern Repose tools.
Yes.
Okay. Hopefully we'll have that in the show notes so people can look that up. Any closing comments about your book, where people can find you, anything that you would like them to know?
Well, first of all, thank you. You just look amazing. I'm really happy.
Oh, it's kind.
I love your curl. My Instagram is probably the best way to find me, or Facebook. If you don't have, I have both a personal and a business page on Facebook. And then the links for my book are all included in my bio, and you can get them. There are a number of links. You don't have to get them necessarily through Amazon, but internationally there is Amazon wherever you are. So Amazon UK it's available that way, but you can also just go to your local bookstore, which of course I would encourage you to do, because then, you're supporting local.
So internationally, probably Amazon might be the only place you can pre-order.
I think so. Yeah.
And then in the United States, the best place for people to order, at least, so I know that you get like different amounts sometimes depending on where people are ordering from, but the best place for you for people to order would be where?
Probably still Amazon, but I know that there are a lot of people who would prefer to support their local bookstores, and it's no problem to go and ask them to pre-order it for you.
Okay. And will you tell me the title one more time?
The New Silversmith.
And then what was the subtitle?
Oh, geez.
Quiz.
Let me look.
Don't swear at me.
All right, I'm looking it up. Techniques for creating nature-inspired jewelry.
And then specifically also about being able to recycle and reuse.
Sustainable, innovative.
Yeah, with sustainable techniques. I love that. So at Nicole, is it at Ringold Nicole or at Nicole Ringgold on Instagram?
Ringold Nicole.
At Ringold Nicole, 2 G's.
2 G's.
In your last name.
Correct.
Ringgold. And Nicole, thank you so much for joining me today. It was such a pleasure to have you, and I'm very excited for this book. And what would you say to someone who has a dream, has an idea, doesn't know if it's possible, feels scared? The world is not perfect. What would you say to that artist?
I'd love to give that person a big old hug and say, you don't know until you try it.
And why would you not want to discover whether or not it's even possible?
Right.
Yeah. Thank you. So go out, do something you've never done before, try something new. Thank you for joining us today. And we'll be back again, hopefully, to talk about torches next time we're on. So thank you again. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.